Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the English Dharma group, the Jade Temple. It's good to see everybody here. Recently, at the Chongmei Temple, which is another Buddhist temple in Stafford that I attend in the afternoons on Sunday, we had an English Dharma group session where we were trying to come up with an explanation of Buddhism, what we called the elevator talk. And this is kind of a condensed version of what Buddhism is all about. And we found out that it was a very difficult assignment to put the concept of Buddhism into a few words. So based on that, we decided that we would try and follow Einstein's advice here. And basically, if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. So we're going to try and explain it today by going into some basics. This is another great quote by Einstein. We are the life that wants to live in the midst of other life that wants to live. You know, he was a great mathematician and scientist, but he had some pretty good concepts as well. I think this is very important. Here's another one from Einstein that frames what we're talking about here. A human being is part of the whole we call the universe. He experiences his thoughts as separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his own consciousness. This delusion is a prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our compassion and embracing all living creatures. Pretty good advice. But the key word here is delusion. And all of us suffer from delusion. We're kind of programmed that way. But Buddhism, in my opinion, is the answer to all of our problems, which is kind of a strong statement. So today we're going to look at Buddhism Simplified and see how it's important to our lives and persistent global problems. As you will see, Buddhism to many people is a bit daunting and unclear. So let's start with, is everybody happy here? Let me see the hands of everybody that's happy. I don't see a whole lot of, there's one over there who's waving. We're going to talk about happiness because that's really what Buddhism is all about, is bringing happiness into our lives. That's the basic Buddhism, and we're going to distinguish between basic Buddhism and some more advanced Buddhism a little bit later. It's another Einstein quote. If you want to be happy in life, tie it to a goal, not to people or objects. How many people here, including me, have gotten attached to objects or to other people? I see some hands just coming up. I think it would be all of us at one point or another. This is clinging and attachment which gets us into trouble. Why? Another Buddha quote here, happiness does not depend on what you have or who you are. It solely relies on what you think. So it's all up here in the mind. It's our perception. How many new people here today? How many know little or nothing about Buddhism? Okay. Get those applications out, would you? The basic concept behind Buddhism, we are not islands. We're all part of this great big world. We're all trying to live lives in the midst of other people that are trying to live lives. We got to remember that. So why are we here today? Maybe something's missing in our life. Trying to understand existence. Anybody ever wrestle with existence? Yeah. Interested in spirituality? Just curious? How about interested in learning more about Buddhism? Confused about Buddhism? Or did you come for the excellent vegetarian food? He came for the food. So what is Buddhism? Is it a religion, a philosophy, a way of life, or a path to happiness? Well, it's a little bit of everything, isn't it? But we're going to look at it as the path to happiness. It's a process of changing the way we think, transforming the mind. Based on the teachings of the Buddha 2,500 years ago, but it's not widely understood. Well, why is that? I had a lunch last week. A lady across the table overheard a conversation I was having with the person next to me about Buddhism, and she said, "Are you a Buddhist?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Well, is that all about the life of Muhammad?" She was serious. There are a lot of people, even friends of mine who have studied Buddhism, that are still a little bit confused about it. That reminds me of another luncheon I went to where there was this elderly lady sitting across the table from a much younger man, and she kept staring at this guy. And it was a little uncomfortable for everybody. Finally, she turned to the man, she said, "Young man, you're probably wondering why I'm staring at you." And he said, "Well, yes, I am." And she said, "Well, you remind me of my third husband." And he said, "Really? How many times have you been married?" And she said, "Twice." So what makes Buddhism confusing? Well, there are 14,000 books on Amazon about Buddhism. And some of them are this thick. How many people are going to read this? Not too many. That's one of the problems. What did I do here? Thank you. So there are also several different schools about Buddhism. You've heard of them. There's Mahayana, Theravada, Vajrayana. Sometimes this doesn't mean anything to anybody except it's confusing. And then there's subgroups. There's Zen Buddhism, there's Tibetan Buddhism, Pure Land, Foguan Shan, and many others. That's very confusing, particularly to someone who just wants to learn a little bit about Buddhism. And then who can pronounce this word besides Shamu? Who can pronounce this word at the bottom here? Anybody? No, because there are a lot of words in Buddhist books that are in Pali or in Sanskrit, and nobody except Tai Li has studied Sanskrit. Sorry. Okay, in addition, there's a lot of conflicting messages in Buddhism. For example, in Tibetan Buddhism, this young lady in the back of the room was at a Tibetan retreat with me in India last year, and they never even discussed the Eightfold Path, which is really, from our understanding, the core of Buddhist teaching. Moreover, Buddhism is not widely known. There are 7 billion people in the world, but only 500 million Buddhists, which is about 7%. And a lot of those are what I call cultural Buddhists, meaning that they're kind of Buddhists in name only. They don't really practice the religion. There's 350 million in China. There's 150 million in Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and so forth. There's about 5 million in the US, and only 800,000 are Westerners. There's no governing body per se, no ecumenical council. It's not really promoted like Christianity or Judaism. A lot of the temples are hidden off of the main drag, so you don't know they're there. You can't see them. They're not highly visible. And there are many books, like I showed you before, that most people are just not going to read. So I wrote a paper a few months ago called Buddhism on the Brink. And this is the cover page, and basically it shows monks trying to cross over a gorge going towards the modern world, the city, but the bridge is broken. And the idea here is that Buddhism, if it's not promoted and it's not well understood, could very easily die off. So we need to be thinking about who's going to be practicing Buddhism in the future. But it's not dead yet, it just needs a revival. So let's go back to happiness. Happiness is based on what we think. It's contentment, it's being at peace, serenity, joy, bliss, satisfaction. Does everybody agree with that? It's pretty much what happiness is all about. But how many people here are happy all the time? I don't see any hands. How about half the time? Yeah. How about never happy? Anybody here never happy? Well, there are people who are never happy. And so we have to look at the reasons why we're not happy. What are the barriers to happiness? Well, here are a few of them. Anger, hate, greed, jealousy, craving. Who can tell me what Schadenfreude is? Let me see a hand of somebody who can tell me what Schadenfreude is. So Schadenfreude is, we have a German here. What is it?
Oh, that's you're happy about when somebody else has bad luck, for instance.
Right. Everybody hear that? It's taking pleasure in somebody else's pain or bad luck or misfortune. Well, has anybody here ever experienced Schadenfreude, that you took pleasure in somebody else maybe not doing so well? Most of us have, right? I mean, come on, let's be honest about this. But is that a good emotion to have? Does that make us happy really? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Does this guy look happy? What do you think? Now, that's an example of somebody who probably sees the world differently from the rest of us. Maybe a little bit of delusion. What are other causes of happiness? Societal problems: war, poverty, disease, genocide, slavery, riots. These things happen every day. Here we are in 2015. We have wars raging in the Middle East, Ukraine, other parts of the world. Does anybody remember how many Americans were killed in Vietnam, roughly? About 50,000, that's right. And we don't know how many Vietnamese, but it was probably at least 10 times that, maybe more. How about in World War I? Anybody know how many people were killed? 17 million. 17 million. The Iran-Iraq war, there was about 1 million people killed. How about World War II? Who can tell me?
70 million.
Did everybody hear that? 70 million people were killed in World War II. 70 million. Who can believe that number? Natural disasters. This is Wimberley, Texas, a couple of weeks ago when we had that big rain. What is that? Anybody know what that is? Yeah, Kathmandu, the earthquake. I don't know how many people were killed, 7,000, 8,000, it's hard to tell. Does anybody remember the Kingston Trio? Old folk, most of you are too young to remember this, but this was a folk singing group, and they did a song called "They're Rioting in Africa." And there was one phrase in there that I underlined: the whole world is festering with unhappy souls. The French hate the Germans hate the Poles, Italians hate Yugoslavs, South Africans hate the Dutch, and I don't like anybody very much. Well, that's a true statement. If you travel around, you'll find out that in Europe, for example, the French don't like the Brits. The Brits don't like the French, and they're very vocal about it. Well, what's this all about? We're all in this thing together. But this is conditioned thinking. They weren't born that way, they learned that. The Buddha said this is all driven by greed and ignorance. So we're going to look at that today. We have a lot of distractions in our lives. Smartphones, texting, internet browsing, mindless apps. What this does is it takes us away from mindfulness, kindness, and compassion because we're too busy. We all do that. I have a good friend who's here today who asked, how do I convert anger and fear into peace and serenity? Would anybody be interested in that? Well, that's what Buddhism will do if you pay attention to the basic guidelines. Okay, here's another Einstein quote that I like. Two things are infinite, the universe and stupidity. And I'm not sure about stupidity. What's he really talking about here? He's talking about ignorance, which means not understanding or misunderstanding, which all of us are guilty of at one time or another because of the way we see the world. And we see the world because this is the way we were trained to see the world from when we were young. We have delusion, we have a distorted perception of reality. Here's another one. Reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. Now, coming from Einstein, what he meant by that is nothing is real. Everything is made up basically of space, electrons, protons, and so forth. But that's pretty heavy stuff. We won't get into that right now. So the main topic today, basic Buddhism, Buddhism Simplified. Buddhism can really go in two paths in our lives. We can choose the monastic path, which is total renunciation. You shave your head, you dedicate yourself to the study of the Buddha's teachings, and you renounce all the worldly activities. You eat to live, you don't live to eat, which is kind of a problem in our world today because most of us, or a lot of us anyway, live for that next meal, particularly people that call themselves foodies. Do we have any foodies in the group here today? So let's look at the process here. Let's start with how the Buddha developed all of this. You know that the word Buddha means the awakened one, and 500 BC, this young guy, 29 years old, is just like the rest of us. He comes from a wealthy family, yes, but he's an ordinary guy. He's not a deity, he's not a god. And he's living on a palatial estate. How many people here have been to India? Anybody? They have these enormous estates in India. I mean, 20, 30, 40 acres. And this is what the Buddha lived on, a big estate with big walls, lots of servants. And he was married, he had a young child. But he had a sheltered life. One day he got outside the walls and he saw what life was really all about. He saw aging, he saw sickness, death, he saw anger, he saw stealing, he saw all the things that he didn't see in his fantasy world. And it woke him up and he said, wow, I've been living in a dream world. It's not real. So he went out and he spent the next 6 years giving up everything to try and figure out what life was all about. Same questions we all probably ask ourselves. 6 years. Great quote from Einstein, it's not that I'm so smart, it's just that I stay with problems longer. That's what the Buddha did. He stayed with it for 6 years until he figured it out. What he discovered is what he calls the human condition, that we are all driven by craving and greed mixed with ignorance and delusion. Craving and greed are partially natural, but mostly learned. Ignorance is mostly a social conditioning. It's learned, at least among most of us. The good news is that both of those can be reversed. We've been programmed from an early age to respond to certain stimuli, the basic stimulus response to triggers. Starts when we're babies. When we're hungry as babies, what do? We cry. And what happens? We get fed. Stimulus response. It gets more sophisticated for most of us when we get older. Not all of us. Some people still cry. But the human conditioning, again, from the Buddha, was all of these things: anger, rage, jealousy, envy, greed, so forth. A lot of this is hardwired. Everybody, or does anybody remember Maslow and his hierarchy of needs? He basically said that we start out with the basic physiological needs: breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, which is kind of stability, excretion, that's important. And then you move up the hierarchy till you get to self-actualization. Well, we get somehow astray from that, and we get away from our needs and we get into our wants. It's the wants that take over. And that's the social conditioning. We always want more. And most of us have learned, or some of us have learned, that having more does not make us happy. Kind of social conditioning you see every day: advertising, movies, pop culture, peer pressure, tastemakers, music, family and friends. These are things that influence our lives all the time. And what do we get? Materialism. Let's supersize everything. More foodies. Narcissism. We all have a little bit of that. And self-centered. How many people are walking around doing this now? They're taking selfies and they're putting it on the internet and sending it around to everybody. What's that all about? How many people remember Pavlov's dog? Any hands? So, Pavlov's dog, Pavlov was doing physiology experiments. And he realized that when he had a bunch of dogs at his laboratory, and when you walk in to the laboratory, as soon as the lab assistant walked in, the dogs would start salivating because they knew they were going to get fed. So he did an experiment that I'm sure you remember, where he would have a piece of meat drop down. At the same time, he'd ring a bell. And the dogs would salivate. And then he stopped dropping the meat. He just rang the bell, and the dogs kept salivating. Well, why is that? Because they learned that response. It's a conditioned reflex. The bell goes off, you're thinking the meat's coming, and you start salivating. So we see this as reinforcement. The more you repeat this, the more you learn it, particularly if there's dopamine involved. Everybody know what dopamine is? It's a chemical in your brain that brings pleasure. Okay. So repetition is reinforcement, which is learning. And if we keep learning good things, that's great. But if we're learning bad things like hate and anger and so forth, it's not so good. Certainly doesn't make us happy. Everybody remember Mies van der Rohe, famous architect? He once said, one of his most famous phrases is that less is more. Well, in our culture, a lot of us think that more is better. Bigger houses, faster cars, you know the whole thing. So which one should we reinforce? Well, I think a lot of us realize that more doesn't bring us happiness. It's impermanent. Everybody know the tourist that was walking around New York and he got lost and he asked the cab driver, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? And the cab driver said, practice, practice, practice. And that's what this is all about. We need to practice what the Buddha taught us every day to overcome the bad stuff that is built up in our minds. That's basically what it's all about. Anybody been watching the French Open? Pretty good tennis, about the best there is. Top players in the world. These guys are hitting the ball at 110 miles an hour. They don't have time to think. They get the racket back, they get their feet in the right position, and they swing through the ball. But it's all programmed. And it's programmed by practice, hours of practice. These guys practice 4 or 5 hours a day, and they've been doing it all their lives. Well, that's what it's all about. Okay. Who remembers Sigmund Freud, besides Barbara? So what was Freud famous for that most of us remember? Key word. Anybody? Ego, right? Everybody remember the ego? And ego is important in Buddhism. What Freud discovered was that all of us have primitive urges and drives. Primitive. We want more. We want that. Give me that. I want that. That's the id. He called it the id. The ego, another part of our personality, figures out how it can satisfy the cravings of the id. So the ego is saying, okay, there's a police officer over there, so don't go take that car. Wait till he's gone. Okay, the ego is managing the id. The superego is the conscience that says, no, 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 don't do that. That's wrong. It's bad. Don't do it. So it's a battle between the ego and the superego. And we all have that. Let's look at some prominent examples of problems with the ego. Anybody recognize these people? So who's this guy right here? Huh? Bernie Madoff. Does everybody know who Bernie Madoff was or is? He ran a Ponzi scheme and took $50 billion from investors. He's now serving he's serving 150 years in prison. Who's this guy right here?
Durst.
Huh?
Durst.
Robert Durst. Who's Robert Durst? He's the son of a billionaire New York real estate developer who is on trial for murder. He was in Galveston a few years ago and he murdered his neighbor and cut his body up and threw it in the water and he got off.
Yeah.
Robert Durst. How about this guy here? Come on. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy murdered over 30 college girls. Who's this right here? Huh? Jodi Arias. Who's Jodi Arias? 30-year-old woman in Utah who was having a relationship with a guy who was a motivational speaker. And they had kind of a torrid love life. And he decided he was going to leave her, so she murdered him. She stabbed him about 27 times, slit his throat, and shot him. What's that all about? It's greed. It's craving. It's ego. This guy, who's that? Jeff Skilling, Enron. Anybody recognize him? How about these two here? Those two are from Chicago. She's, I think, 18 or 19. He's 21. And they were having an affair in Chicago. The mother didn't approve of it, took the daughter to Bali to get away. He follows them there, and the two of them murdered the mother. They're now in the jail in Indonesia. Who's this guy here? Who? Yeah, he's one of the guys that set off the bomb at the Boston Marathon. Okay, so a lot of ego here, a lot of delusional thinking. And this is just a handful of, we could stay here all day. Who's this guy? Who?
The last name is Stanford.
Yeah. Alan Stanford. Does anybody recognize him? He's a Houston businessman who set up an investment operation that was another Ponzi scheme, and he took $5 billion from people, and now he's in prison. That's Stanford and his girlfriend. This is him in his new uniform. Looks pretty good, huh? Who's this guy? He's the Lufthansa airline pilot that killed everybody. What kind of delusional thinking? So this just gives you a few examples. The common thread here is greed, desire, craving, a distorted sense of self. That's what the problem is here. So how does one change anger and fear into peace and serenity? What daily activities can facilitate that process? Well, another Einstein quote, "A man should look for what is and not what he thinks should be." So let's talk about road rage. Has anybody had road rage here? One honest person. All of us have had road rage, right? All we want to do is drive down the street and get where we're going, and some idiot cuts in front of us, and we get angry. Why is that? Because our expectation is that we're going to drive and have no problems. But what's the chance of that happening? Okay, so you got two kinds of drivers out there that are going to cut in front of you. One is they're just not paying attention, they're ignorant. Okay? And we've all done that. Have you ever changed lanes not looking and someone blows their horn? Most of us have. Okay, fine. Then there's the arrogant guy that doesn't care that you're there. He just pulls over in front of you. But the fact is, those things are going to happen every day. You can count on it. So for us to think that it should be different is delusional. And we're going to be unhappy. We're going to get angry. Is the other guy in the other car going to get angry? No. All right. We talked about road rage here. We can't change what's going to happen, but we can change how we react to it. And that's really what this is all about. Here's some other kinds of delusion. I will be happy when I get a new dog, shotgun, hairstyle, job, boyfriend, house, car, clothes. Have we all done that? Of course we have. It's the dopamine. When we think about having something new, that neurotransmitter starts flowing into our brains and we feel good. and we buy something. It's normal. But the purpose of this talk and studying Buddhism is to develop the wisdom to understand how all of that works and cut it off. Recognize that it's not going to get us anywhere. Most of this stuff is impermanent. Even houses are impermanent. How many people have had more than one car? Let me see your hands. More than one car in your lives. Come on. Yeah. Why do we get a new car or another car? Well, the old one is old, or we get tired of it. So we get a new car. It's impermanence. All right. Let's look at the self or the ego. What is the self? Well, the self is us, right? It's the body, it's the mind, and everybody is different. So the self is real. Some people get confused about this in Buddhism. They think, well, the self, there is no self. That's not true. There is a self. The issue with Buddhism and the self is you don't want the self to operate as an island. You want to look at yourself as being part of everybody else, because we all are here to live life. And we need to respect everybody's life. By the way, the self is always changing. We're not the same person we were when we were 10 years old or 20 years old or 30 years old. We keep changing. In fact, we're not the same person we were yesterday. And after this talk, some of you may not be the same as you were when you walked in here. You see things a little differently, so your mind is constantly changing. So there is no static self. It's a work in progress. But basically, we're dealing with the battle between the ego and the superego. It's a great quote by Einstein. Basically, this formula means that the more knowledge you have, the less ego you have. And the less knowledge you have, the more ego you have. Does everybody understand that equation? So knowledge, or what the Buddhist term is wisdom, we need more wisdom in our lives. Wisdom, mindfulness, and effort. I'd like all of you to remember those three things. Wisdom is understanding the Buddhist teachings. We're going to get into that in just a minute here. Mindfulness is being aware of all of this stuff all the time, all day long. So we're doing the right thing. And effort, why do we have effort up there? Because the bad stuff is pretty powerful. It's easy to get sucked into wanting more, isn't it? Of course it is. It's hard to say no. All right. I'll quote this. This is Hinapola Gunaratana. This guy has written, he's from Sri Lanka, and he's written some great books. I'm going to recommend this to everybody. 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness. One of the best books on Buddhism I think you'll find. And I'll quote one of his parts of the book. The path to final freedom can be understood as a process by which we learn to recognize distorted perceptions for what they are and replace them with correct perceptions. I mean, that's basically what it's all about. So here are the tools that the Buddha gave to us. The Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the 5 precepts, and then some key Buddhist terms. All right? So the Four Noble Truths, some of you already know what this is, but this is the core of the Buddhist teaching, and basically what it's all about is that life has suffering. There was one of the young women that was at that retreat with us in India, when we finally had a breakout session. She said, well, I'm not suffering. Her idea of suffering was someone who gets their hand cut off. But the suffering we're talking about here is what we mentioned earlier. It's the unhappiness based on anger, hate, greed, and so on. Suffering can be eliminated. That's the third step. And the fourth step is that the way to eliminate suffering is the Eightfold Path. We're going to start with the human condition, and then we're going to reverse it by applying our wisdom and the tools that he gave us. So here's the Eightfold Path. And a lot of you already know this, but do you really think about it all the time? Because if you don't, you're missing out on what's going on. So the Eightfold Path was to develop the right view of things. That's number one. Seeing reality and not fantasy. The second step is the right thinking, which means being helpful, being positive, being humane. The third step is the right speech. No lying, no hurtful things, no gossip. Does gossip do any good for people? No. The right action, generosity, being helpful to others. The right livelihood. How about a drug dealer? Is that the right livelihood? No. How about working for Enron in those days? Was that the right livelihood? Actually, a lot of people that worked there knew what was going on. They knew it was bad, but they didn't want to leave because they're making a lot of money. And one of them, just as soon as Enron cratered, you might remember the guy in Sugar Land that killed himself. The right effort, we talked about this. You got to work at this. It's not going to happen without the effort. And then, of course, mindfulness, being aware of what's going on in our lives. And the last one, concentration, is meditation. And it's important to understand here that meditation is really in two forms. One is the calming effect that slows down our mind so that we can put aside what we call the crazy monkey and have some peace. But the second and more important part of meditation is to be thinking about all of these guidelines and how they relate to how we're living our lives, because we want to change how we're living our lives, and that's going to bring happiness. Okay. The result of all of this is you're going to have positive values, you're going to have integrity, you're going to have virtue. Now, most of us have that, but not all the time. Let's talk about the 5 precepts. The 5 precepts are kind of just rules to live by, and there's nothing special here, but they're simple. No killing. Now, this is a controversial issue here because you frequently get into conversations with people who say, well, what about killing a mosquito or fire ants or pests? And so this is interpreted differently by everyone, but the concept here is don't kill just for the sake of killing. I can argue that if there's a rabid dog that's about to attack my children, I'm probably going to kill that dog. But that's a very controversial subject, and it's not worth it to get way off on that rabbit trail. The idea here is killing is bad. No stealing. Well, that seems like it's pretty obvious, but look at all these guys at Enron that were basically stealing. I mean, I don't want to pick on Enron necessarily, but the fact is, that's what was going on. Sexual misconduct, what does that mean? It doesn't mean you shouldn't have sex. It means you shouldn't have rape, shouldn't have incest, shouldn't have sex with somebody else's wife or husband. I mean, it's inappropriate sex. No lying. Do you think anybody in government pays attention to that? I mean, does our government ever lie to us? Yeah, all the time. So, remember the quote that was up on the screen when you walked in here? It was Gandhi's quote, "Be the change you want to see." So just because the government lies, does that mean it's right? No. And none of us are going to be happy when we lie. So don't do it. No intoxication. Now what does that mean? Does that mean you shouldn't have a glass of wine? No. But what happens to many people, as we all know, because I'm guilty of this, is you have one glass of wine, and then you have two more, and then you have the bottle, and now you're on your second bottle, and you can barely pour it. Anybody ever done that? Come on, let me see. Huh? One honest guy back here. God. Well, we've all done that. So, but we know it gets us in trouble, doesn't it? It's not worth it. Okay. Path to happiness. So we're going to be reprogramming the way we think. That's what this is all about. And we're going to do that through daily practice of the Buddha's teachings. We talked about suffering, impermanence. Compassion is pretty obvious. You know, we're all in this thing together, so look out for your fellow man. Even if he's an Italian and you're a Yugoslav. All right, summary. So, Buddhism's a way of life. I mean, that's basically it. We're going to change the way we see the world, we're going to change our perceptions, and we're going to practice doing things the right way. And that's going to give us lasting happiness. I like this one. Can you read that? One who wants to see immediate results from his work should become a shoemaker. This is not going to happen overnight, guys. But you have to work on it every day. We're back to Gandhi again. Okay, questions? What?
Excellent presentation with audio visuals. Excellent, Gerry. Thank you.
Oh.
But I just want to correct one word. In Pali, dukkha means not suffering, it's unsatisfactoriness.
Okay.
Buddha not only told unsatisfactoriness, he told how to get out of that and have the happiness like you mentioned here.
Does everybody understand that? Have you guys figured this out? Any other questions? We've got some time here, if any of this is unclear.
Do you believe if I told you I never drunk?
You never
Once I never drank.
drink?
Yeah, like you said, after one bottle and another bottle, I don't do that.
Yeah,
So
I believe
I
that.
experienced that, what you just said.
Well, don't start. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are a few people that never drink alcohol and have never been drunk, and that's good.
I drink, but I don't get drunk.
Oh, really?
One drink only.
What's your secret?
Just don't do it.
Well, not all of us are that talented. Sometimes after we have the first drink, the second one, we've already changed our thinking and we think, I'm fine.
Apparently, it's no impact on me.
I think it's just superior genetics.
Gerry, isn't that more than just drinking?
Yeah, drugs. Yeah, absolutely.
precept, not killing, I want to extend it to not harming others.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people just think about if I kill you, then it's a violation, but it's also about harming others, and that can be in various ways, through speech, through physical things. I have one question, although it's more putting this thought out on your gallery of murderers. You also had pictures of Robin Williams and Seymour Hoffman.
Yeah, that wasn't intended to be murderers. It was intended to be people who had big issues.
Right.
And both of those guys, as you may know, Philip Seymour Hoffman died of an overdose of heroin. And very talented actor. Unfortunately, he had been an addict for many years. And Robin Williams was also having serious problems with drugs and alcohol, and he eventually killed himself. Nikki.
Question about, so the way you portray the whole mindfulness and practice.
A little louder, please.
It's almost like a lifestyle.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's the difference between Buddhist and the lifestyle and actually practice the religion, religious practices? Because I'm not religious, but I think Buddhist is a wonderful lifestyle.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an important point. Most religions that we know of are based on a deity, that you're going to follow what God tells you to do. And if you don't, you're going to get in big trouble. Buddhism is more of a self-reliant practice, that these are the tools that you can use to lead a good life and be happy. No one's going to watch you and say, you're not following the rules. It's up to you to measure and ask yourself, is this working? Am I better off because I'm following these rules?
I think once you get into the realm of like karma and rebirth, that's when you get into the more religious aspects. Things that you can't produce empirical evidence for, you just have to accept on faith.
Yeah, and those of you who know about Buddhism obviously can see that I didn't even mention karma and rebirth and realms and some of these other more esoteric concepts in Buddhism, because you don't need to understand them right now to have a happy life. And that's the goal here. Now, once you decide that Buddhism works for you, and you've mastered the basic Buddhism, and you're interested in going beyond that, there's a lot of stuff you can study. There's the Dhammapada, there's the sutras, there's a lot of reading that you can do and learn about some of these more advanced topics. Yep.
And our work. So we're in Houston, so many of us might work for big oil companies that on one hand provide us with electricity and air conditioning and all those wonderful things, and on the other hand foul the air and pollute our water, our environment, and potentially create global warming that will lead to our demise. So is it ethical to work for one of these kind of companies?
Did everybody hear that question? Anybody have a comment on that? Since many of you actually, there's one of those evil people back there. And
but to me, if you go to the like 300, 400 years, you just use horses, cows, and a lot of hurting you are doing. But if you are consciously doing the balance and making life easier, I think that is okay with the 8-4 path, correct way of living. You don't harm, you are trying to help other people to move from place to place, but not the pollution. Yes, very important point. And how to manage it properly. So.
Anybody else?
you're saving your people. But in order to do that, you have to kill somebody else. So it's always, like we were saying, killing is the controversial point. So on the same line, some occupations are like that, and you cannot really argue whether, I'm sure you cannot leave your job and sit at home because you are so worried about polluting the environment, and you're trying to be good about it, but sometimes you cannot do that. I mean, in order to live a living, you have to do something, and it might have indirect relation to few things. For example, we pay taxes, and those tax money is used for several things. One is going to the defense research, or the factories that produce arms and all these ammunition. So that is used for killing. So indirectly, we all are supporting to that, and I think you should not stop. So as long as you're not doing it intentionally, like you're killing somebody, that's a different thing. But all these things, like doing a regular job and being mindful about not doing it intentionally, then I think it should be okay. I mean, again, it's controversial, so I won't have an answer.
No, that's a good answer.
I'm just saying that it's never going to be
Perfect.
yeah.
I'd like to add something. The book that you are mentioning, can you just split it up?
Yeah.
This is an excellent book that spends some time, the author spends some time about talking about the right occupation, and ultimately it comes down to what is your call, what do you view personally as harming. Then he gives an example that I personally, it spoke to me. He talked about hateful broadcasting, and I'm thinking of a local radio host who is for me the epiphany of hateful speech. And so for me, that is what I view as violation, if you want to call it that way, of a livelihood. Yet for others in Houston, he is an idol. Okay, he is the man. And so it comes down to my personal beliefs. As Lalit just mentioned, the author also mentioned, if you, for example, if you work in a factory producing pesticides, is that wrong livelihood? So it is a delicate subject, and I'm really curious to hear what Venerable Hong Yi has to say about it when he talks about right livelihood moving forward in his series Sunday of the month.
Yeah, I think what Lalik said is really the important concept here, and that is intent. Does anybody remember Love Canal? Which was, Doug, what was Love Canal?
It was a toxic waste dump that some entrepreneur decided he'd build a subdivision on top of, and that was forgotten that there was this toxic waste until people started having horrible cancers and various.
All right, this was a company that
Niagara Falls, U.S., on the U.S. side, yeah.
Yeah.
Niagara Falls, New York.
Yeah, and this company...
Hooker Chemical, I think.
Exactly. This company developed a chemical that would clean metal, a solvent. And once the metal is cleaned, you had the waste solvent, and they decided to just dump it in the ground.
Oh, it might have been carbon tetrafluoride?
Probably.
I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Now that you mention it.
Nasty stuff.
Really nice.
So it got into the water supply, and as Doug said, they had this subdivision. People started getting cancer and dying and so forth, and so there was a huge lawsuit. Now, back to your question, they did that intentionally. They tried to cover it up, but the fact is they didn't want to dispose of it the right way because it cost too much money. So they just took it out in the back and they dumped it. And that is intentional. Now, what a lot of the oil companies are doing today is what the Buddha would call the middle path. And who can explain the middle path? Justin, do you want to take a shot at that?
Okay, I'll talk. It can mean don't go to either extremes. Go in the middle way. For example, same topic. the oil companies, most of the major oil companies, when they process all the chemicals, they take the water from the river or the groundwater, then they have biotreater, they'll take care of all the thing and put it. One thing I know for sure, because I did that one, we use in the Louisiana chemical production, and we use Mississippi water. We know how much toxic chemicals are there, and we also produce some of those chemicals, and we have a biotreater we take care of. In fact, we were cleaning the water more than what we are getting in. So there you go. So you can do that. But at the early part of the technologies, people polluted. There's no question for the PCBs and all those things. But I think over here in USA, we are doing much better compared with most of the third world countries. Yes, they need to do something. So middle path means, yes, if most of the people are benefiting, people, environment, and animal, let's do that one rather than go to the extremes.
So my follow-up to that is how can we, you talked about delusion
Yeah,
early on.
yeah.
How can we not be delusional in our thinking about that? So it's pretty easy for us to rationalize almost any kind of behavior. How can we?
Particularly when we're getting a paycheck.
Yeah, and our families being fed and communities are thriving.
Yeah. Well, this is about ethics and morals. We have to make a moral judgment and an ethical judgment. So if we know that these people are deliberately dumping, then we have to make the decision that we probably ought to leave that company. When we were at that retreat in India, one of the students in my group said, if you're going to work for a corporation, you have to learn how to lie. And he believed that. He said, that's just part of the business world. You need to be able to lie. Now, how many people agree with that? No, you don't have to lie. Now, you may not work there. You know, you can decide to go someplace else, which is what you should do. But you have to have some critical thinking, and you have to look at what they're doing. You know, a lot of the coal industry right now is caught in this conundrum right now because the government wants them to put expensive scrubbers on their smokestacks. And I mean expensive, millions of dollars to put these things in. And the coal companies are saying, well, if we put those in, we're not going to make as much money. We're going to have to increase our product cost, pass it on to the consumer. Well, sometimes the consumer won't pay that. So what do? That's a tough decision. It's a financial or a business decision. It's not a conscious decision to pollute the air. Because these companies are in business to make money. They're not charitable. So what do? I mean, it's tough.
Cut down on the profits.
Yeah, and if they have any profit, sure, that makes sense. But some of them don't even have any profit. Carlos.
Yes, I would like to mention some point that I don't know why did you mention because you really do a very good general job, excellent. But you didn't mention about one of the most important teachings of the Buddha, which is the teaching of non-self.
Non-self.
Yeah, and the teaching of non-self is really the key teaching of Buddhism, because it is saying that really the I, the ego that we think that we are living around in really doesn't exist, that is an illusion. And all the work that we have to do is just getting rid of this sense of I, or sense of ego, of this selfishness that we are in. That's what I would like to mention.
Yeah, so does everybody understand what this means, non-self? We've got just a few more minutes here, so let's... let's explore this because it is important. I kind of stay away from it because, again, self is one of these things that many people don't understand. But what the Buddha means here about non-self is don't have the world revolving around you. That's kind of the concept behind non-self. That early slide that I had on there that man is living life amongst other people that are living their life. And that's what we need to keep in mind here, that we are not an island. We are definitely a self. Do you have a self? I'm looking at the self. We all have a self. But the self can be good and bad. The self can be compassionate. It can be kind. It can be considerate of everybody else because we're all in this thing together. Does that make sense? Astor's sitting there saying, no, this is all. Any other, yes?
Yeah, thank you so much for the education you've provided today. I really appreciate that. The universe is a whole, and in my opinion, self is just a label. I mean, we're all unique cells, just like we're all unique DNA. And so the transmissions from the universe that makes me function, makes everyone else function, but in a very unique. So I don't see the word self as an issue. I see it as a label.
Yeah.
I see it as the thing that describes this manifestation.
It's a placeholder.
Right. But everything functions as part of the universe. If we think harmoniously and behave harmoniously, we benefit the entire universe, including all of the people and things around us. If we behave and think this harmoniously, then we negatively impact.
Right.
But so this is the idea.
Absolutely.
We see ourselves, and you've taught we're not islands. We're part of the island. We're part of the universe.
Now, some people think we're part of the energy.
Right.
You know, that gets a little...
Right.
My friend Debbie and I here have had many conversations about who we are. So if you ask her who she is, she might tell you that she's an architect. Or she might tell you that she's a project manager. But we're not asking what she does. I said, well, who are you, Debbie? So she might say, well, I'm a mother of 2 children. I didn't ask you if you were a mother. You know. And so you can see the line of thinking here when we start drilling down and we say, well, who are we? We're just a collection of the thoughts and the knowledge we've gained over many years. But we're not some special entity, except Ty Lee. But seriously, that issue is important for us to be clear about, because the ego, once again, says you are important and you need to do everything you can to take care of what that craving id is telling you. That's what the ego does. You need to make more money, even if you have to steal it. Right? Any other comments, questions? Thanks, everybody.